we've had an exposition of master planning at an almost global scale, a drilling down by Alex into making a real neighbourhood work in different ways, and then almost a stepping back to a city region level, not unlike what we're contemplating now in terms of scale, setting out the next few years in direction and thinking from Louise. And I thought that point about diverse ecologies was quite important, because the arc isn't one place. It's different geologies, it's different sociology, it's different networks. A lot of it actually radiated out from London. So it's not a unitary thing. It's a conceptual network in the northern part of the outer southeast, if you like. So what might the lessons be from some of what we've heard from these presenters, and the things that they've triggered among you that we might apply if we start thinking about the arc? So we've gone widely and drilled down in different ways, but we're going to lead in after lunch to look a little bit more at housing. So before we get to that, are there some key themes and issues or questions that you would like to put to this group that it's triggered? But I would like us to be starting to think about the arc conceptually. So I've got 1, 2 here, and 1 over there. And if you could, again, even if you have already spoken, if you could just say who you are, it would help everyone else. Remember, 60 seconds maximum.
Paul Miner from the Campaign to Protect Rural England. Really interesting series of presentations, a lot to think about. Particularly interested in the one in Barton, which I think our local group opposed, but I think gives us food for thought. In terms of the Oxford-Cambridge arc, I wanted to get the panel's reactions to this, which is that we commissioned a poll from Survation about public attitudes to the development of the arc, which we published a few weeks ago. And one thing that was particularly interesting for me in terms of the results was that when asked what they thought was the highest priority out of well-designed new houses, providing affordable housing and infrastructure improvements, the public's response across the counties of the arc was that they wanted affordable housing prioritised over the other two. And I wanted to get the panel's response was and how they thought that might influence the development of the ARC proposals, and in particular where the building might take place.
Okay, if we just take the next one, please, and then we'll ask the panel.
Stuart Turner, and probably a question that I would like to ask of Louise. I spent a couple of days up in Birmingham last week on quite an intensive exercise looking at regionalism. I wanted to learn a lot more about how we approach the strategic level and inform us of what's about to happen here. And as part of that, the visit, there was a phrase used by, I think, one of your colleagues, Henry Kippen. It referred to inclusive economic growth. And it was a combination of those two words, the first two words of those, that really got me going. So I wanted to ask you if you could just elaborate a little bit on that, because there's a model that we're looking for, I suspect, and it's about, I suspect underlying all of that is environmental issues, the green thread that's running through that, how we bring those two elements together and build a model between those different facets of growth.
Thanks very much, Stuart. There is a link. Is it a connected point, Nicholas? Yeah. Could we take Nick Falk, please?
Louise, at the same event, I went to Wolverhampton, and it's dead. And I know Dudley died a long time ago. It does seem to me you have a challenge, not just about building housing or on empty spaces, but putting life back into the heart of our historic towns. And I wondered how you were going to do that, and in particular, do something that gets the economy moving again. I have a feeling that actually making the place look attractive is the first step, but it's no good just tarting up the streets. You've got to actually put life into the shops.
So there is a link there between them, and one might argue on this particular day of elections when there are many marginalised communities across the country voting one way or another based on some of these themes. So if we start with the housing one, how to address affordable housing, which is a priority. And this isn't, I would say I'm interpreting it not just as an urban thing? Presumably some of this request for affordable housing is also much more from rural dwellers as well?
The polling was done across the 5 counties of the Arc, so Oxfordshire, Northampton, Hants, Bucks.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts on that?
I'll have a crack at the affordable housing one. I mean, I agree. I think affordable housing has to be, a pretty major part of the ARC and those developments. I think the issue the danger is that if we impose sort of housing targets as a big number on communities and local authorities that no one particularly likes, then you get people rallying against it. I mean, if you look at Oxfordshire at the moment, there's a bit of politics at play in one particular district, which maybe they're trying to bring their numbers back. They just don't want the development. It's the classic, we've had enough growth, thanks, we're done now. And so you've got to try and sell what you're doing to them. I think just a housing number doesn't really do that. You've got to say, if that's what the public in any particular area wants, is affordable housing, fine, you just prioritise affordable housing as part of that mix. If it's about schooling, well, that's the next one that you're going to be targeting. Inevitably, there's that question about how much of the private can fund that affordable over time. I mean, that's a sort of a debate in itself. But in those higher value areas, it can. I'm not so sure necessarily in the more marginal areas, but I think that's a bit of a no-brainer to say that affordable housing is a large percentage of that housing delivery.
So then that comes down to whether the affordable housing is funded by the market or whether there are other mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, but Barton, we fund the 40% affordable housing, but the 100% social rent of that via the house prices on the 60% private and part of the structure in terms of land value. And the good people of the Oxford comments section of the Oxford Mail would say these houses are unaffordable. Well, they're cross-fertilising the sort of very low value social rented. So that's how the economics of that works at the moment without grant and everything else it used to be.
Louise?
Sure, I'm happy. I'll comment from a more of a regional perspective, I guess. And you're right, Kevin. Up until a month or so ago, I was working in Homes England, and one of my teams was led by Sarah Greenwood, who's absolutely brilliant lady who lives in this region, and it was called Inclusive Growth, Strategic Growth in that case, and she was very much looking at the ARC and working closely with all the councils, the local players, DFT, the universities, the myriad of stakeholders. In fact, we did a stakeholder map. It was scary. It was a piece of, I think it was A2, and it was covered in names. So the first process was to think carefully about, the ecology of the multiple communities that are in the ARC, the programs of activity from DFT, the environmental piece is huge. We've got to get that right. So it is complex, and of course, and Sarah works for Homes England, and housing is an important part of the journey, and we've looked at how housing and infrastructure can start to cross-subsidise each other and create the right communities in the right places. And there's lots of conversations around, is it 20 dots along the line, or is it 3 dots, dots being where the conurbations were, and the junctions of HS2 and East West Rail start to become really important. So I think the mindset that we had then, I think Sarah's continued this work, is to see housing as a form of infrastructure, actually, alongside the physical infrastructure, whether it's green or steel or metal or digital indeed. And to think, you can't think about these components in isolation, and through thinking a bit more strategically and in a more connected way, and seeing where the values lie, and then levering the values for the affordable housing, which I think was the question at the beginning, that becomes really, really important, and just it'll end up in smaller sites, but we felt as government, and certainly as the National Infrastructure Commission, you've got to be looking in that sort of regional spread at the same time. We're
going to move into the inclusive growth part, but the risk in that sounds to me that if it's predicated on value creation, some of those areas where the values are that you said can't be attained, it's difficult to get the cross-subsidy necessary for the affordable housing that's required. Sorry,
I mean, the point I was going to make was about, all three questions are linked. I mean, we're desperate to try and promote growth and economic growth and so on. And in Wolverhampton, we particularly need to do so, but we've been doing so across the whole country. I mean, Richard Florida at our Congress last year talked about the crisis of the city. And his point was that we've been promoting growth to the point where cities have become unaffordable. We're talking about affordability not just as affordable housing, but for all of us. I mean, I suspect if we were all first-time buyers, we'd all struggle to afford a new house now because housing has become extremely unaffordable. Oxford being the classic case, as Alex said, the most unaffordable place in the country. So when people want affordable housing in a college, they're not necessarily talking about the technical term of affordable housing. They're wanting to be able to afford housing. Somewhere like Oxford, you need more housing to allow that to happen. You need to actually deal with the supply and demand issues, which Oxford's policies in the past have meant that it's got an incredible shortage of housing. So it always all linked together. We do need housing growth in order to deal with that supply and demand issue.
Do you want to say anything else about inclusive growth? Or
Yeah, I mean, to speak to the Dudley point and try and do this for housing innovation at the same time, yes, we're going to have to think about high streets, certain high streets aren't going to be as they are now in the future. So we've got to rethink that, reconceptualize that. But we've been looking at some interesting innovations and some technology from different parts of the world. And there was something I saw in a lecture that was at last night, and I'm not an expert in this, but it got my brain ticking around how we can digitally print bridges now, and they're doing that. There's stuff happening in different parts of the world where homes are being digitally printing at a very affordable, 24K or something for a home. Now, I think that is a pilot phase, but the day will come when it won't be just the volume house builders delivering housing. And the role of Homes England is to start to disrupt the housing market, to work with the innovators. It's why we brought the Japanese partners in. It's why the government are getting behind people they perhaps wouldn't have previously got behind. And that's how you change the dial, I think.
Can I just respond? I'm sure a lot of thinking is needed. But it also needs urgent action. It is like the First World War, and we need a kind of triage system, and we've got to stop building new housing on derelict sites, desirable as it is, and put the effort into taking over and reusing existing buildings before they rot or go up in flames. It's only time now before we have the next lot of riots. It's only time before neglected roofs lead to the buildings getting dry rot and so on. And it seems to me a scandalous waste of resources. No wonder that people have voted for Brexit or whatever when they see the heart of their towns dying in front of their eyes. So it does seem to me we need urgent action. I do recommend people go to Leipzig to see what can be done to bring life back into a place which has suffered far more economically than any English city, but where they actually have acted rather than just having studies.
Thanks, Nick. Leipzig is worth a visit. We've got one more here. John
Worthington. I want to try and bring it back, actually, to our first session, because the two work together. I think what we learned from Rotterdam, two words, actually. First of all, actually, Martin talked about inclusiveness. But his inclusive growth was naturally what you did, which is very important. That's the important thing. How do you give back wealth? And it's not just monetary wealth. It's actually cultural wealth and all the others coming together. The second one is actually that you've got that growth, but then there's the issue of actually how... I've lost the tone there.
Giving back cultural wealth and other elements.
Yeah, and the second thing is actually then placemaking. We talk a lot about placemaking. What the word placemaking in Dutch is stadsmaker, a city maker. Those city makers are the people we heard about in Birmingham, where you were talking about with people like 00 and doing work there. Where you actually just people out there in your Wolverhamptons starting to do things. It's lots of incremental things at the beginning which you do. So the things you normally do at the end of a project, which is 30 years away, you start doing now. You just go out and make things. And lastly, what we heard was actually just, well, be willing to just do what's most opportune to do. Don't wait till somebody above tells you. Just get out and do it. So as a city, what Rotterdam said is, we got a bit held up here, so let's just swivel a bit and do something else. So they were resilient. They moved around. There's some real lessons to bring them together.
Thanks very much, John. I think that's an excellent point. Just make things. That's kind of how Wolverhampton started, as I recall, in the Black Country and so on. And that's what, yeah. But and as it grew and the networks, and I think that's what Eindhoven have done in their post-industrial rethink and their innovation. So I'm going to take that as a big plug for Congress next month, because Eindhoven effectively has done that, having gone through a major economic collapse. I think we've had some fantastic presentations and some really good discussion, and I think you can see the connecting threads around place, around strategic elements, around process. I'm going to be interested to see if someone's going to produce a map bit like David's one. I don't know if it's a 100-kilometre one, but if we can get a blueprint figure ground for the arc, that would be quite nice for next year. But it's that, I thought what was lovely about Dave's presentation was the moving in terms of scales, thinking at a street scale to a city region scale. And that issue of scalarity, for me, is one of the big themes that's come out of this morning. I think John Best's point about blue-green networks and so on, and that could apply across the whole area, but it could apply to one development or one little kind of micro area in a neighbourhood. So there are a whole range of key messages. I'd like you to thank all our speakers, including the ones we've just had, for the contributions. And we look forward to, are we going to come back at 2:30, Jazz? Is that? Yeah.
Lunch is going to be both in that room there, but also downstairs as well, so we can get served tight.
So we can, in order to get the numbers through, some of you next door and some downstairs. So see you all back at 2:30. Thanks very much.